Hello everyone. Welcome to the series of lectures on database systems. In this video, we will discuss about data manipulation language. So there are actually four SQL statements for this data manipulation. So we can actually use these four statements. So three of them are used to actually update the data. So you can actually update the data, and one of them is used to retrieve the data or access the data, or you can say display the data from the table. So all of these work on the table. So let's first see how we can add data into the table. So to add data into the table, actually there is an insert into statement which is used to actually add rows into the data table. So the general syntax of this insert into statement is something like this. So you have these insert into keywords, and then there is a table name in which we want to insert the data, and then there is optional list of columns for which we want to add the data. So this can be omitted, and we will see how. And then we have the values keyword, and then we have the value list, that is the list of the values that we want to assign to the columns. So what actually this statement says is that we want to insert into this table name, whatever the name may be. So we want to insert in this table, and there is the list of the columns for which we want to insert the data, and this is actually the data or the data values that we want to insert into the list of the columns. So apparently this insert into the values, these are the keywords which are fixed and their meaning is fixed. And then we have this column list, and this is of course optional, so we can actually omit this. And what it means, like we want to store the data for all the columns in the table. So if we want to insert the data and we actually provide the data for all the columns, then this is optional, and we can we don't have to we don't need to write the list of column names. So this comma list is optional. And then there is a value list. So value list is actually mandatory, and of course this is mandatory because when we don't have any values, then there is actually no question of adding data into the table in the first place. So of course the data must be there to insert into the table. So value list is actually the comma separated list of values that we want to insert into the table columns. So let's see some examples to insert in the data into the table. So first we actually need to create the table. So this is actually the same table that we have discussed previously. So this is the table named employee, and there are certain columns. So we can quickly see what is in the table. So the name of the table is employee, and there is an empid attribute or column which is of character data type with 4 characters, the length of the column. And then we have the first name and the last name, and both are of a variable character data type, and then both are not null, so it means there must be the value for these columns. And then we have the salary column, which is of numeric type with 7 precision and 2 scale, and the default value is 10,000. And then there is a constraint on this column. The name of the constraint is employee and max salary, and what the constraint says is that the salary must not be greater than 95,000. And then finally this column cannot be null, so of course there must be some salary for the employee. And then we have the column gender, and the data type of this column is char and the length is 1, so only one character we can store there. The default value for this is m, and there is a constraint for this column, and this constraint's name is employee gender domain. So actually this constraint is about the domain of the column, and domain of the gender column says that its value must be f or m. And then finally this gender domain gender column is also not null, so there must be a value either f or m, so it cannot be null. And then we have another column called designation, and its value is varchar, and then there is no constraint for the not null, so this is the only column in the table that can be null, and all the other columns above there must be a valid value for them. Only the designation column is the one that can be null. And finally we have the constraint named employee empidpk. So actually we name it because we want to remember that this is the primary key on the employee ID column and in the employee table. So whenever this constraint is violated, we can know that this is the violation of this this constraint. And then this is the primary key, of course. So this table is created. Now we actually turn to inserting data into this table. So we have many cases. The first of the cases, we want insert the data for all columns, and then we have the values for all columns. So in this case we actually write the complete query. So we have the insert into employee, the table name, and then we have the list of all the columns in the table. So we have the emp id, first name, last name, salary, gender, and finally designation. And then we have the values keyword, and then we have the values for all the columns in the table. So there must be a match between the columns and between the data values. So actually this E001 is the value for the EMP ID, and this Raza is the name for the first name, is the value for the first name. Ahmed is the value for the last name. This 90,000.50 is the value for the salary. This M is the value for the gender, and this manager is the value for the designation. So when we run this statement, actually a first row is inserted into the table. And then we have another case where we want to insert the data for all the columns, but actually without naming the columns, or without writing the comma separated list of the columns. So here we have this insert into employee, and then we just have values. You see that there is no list of column names here, because we want to insert the values to all the columns. So this E02 is the value for the EMP ID. This Fiza is the value for the first name. Khan is the value for the last name. This 90,000 is the value for the salary. If this F is the value for the gender, and then manager is the value for the designation. So you see we have the values for all the columns. So actually we don't need to write the names of the columns, because this is optional and this is already assumed from the values. So this part is redundant here. We could have skipped this part in the previous query. So this query and this query are exactly same. So this is actually the short version of the query. So we are inserting the data for all the columns in the table. And then we have another case where we want to insert the data for the columns with the default values, and then we actually use the default keyword. So note that in the table we have some default values for the columns. For example, we have the default value for the salary column, and then we have the default value for the gender column. So we can actually use the default values. So here we are actually trying to insert the default values. So we have this query with the same column names, and then actually for the column names, the only difference from in this query from the previous query is that we are not providing the value for the salary column, and we are not providing the value for the gender column. So we are using the default keyword, and what it means is that the default value for these columns is used. So for the salary column it is 10,000, and for the gender column it's M, and we can verify this from the table definition. So the default value for the salary is 10,000, and this will be provided if we don't provide any, and then the default gender is M, and this value will be provided. So in this query actually this default means the default value will be used. And then again this is actually the same without using the column names. So in this query, for example, we are using the default values but without column names. We actually don't provide the names of the columns and neither the values. So for example, here we are only providing the values for the EMP ID, first name and then last name, and then we are not providing any value for the column salary, for the column gender, and for the column designation. So what happens in this query, we are only inserting three values for the three columns, and note that if we are providing only three values, then we need to name the columns. Otherwise, because there are more than three columns in the table, so this would be invalid. If we skip this comma separated list of the column names, then this query will generate error, because there are more columns and there are fewer values for the columns. So because we list the columns, so this query is valid and the rows will be inserted. What happens that is for this row, i.e. employee ID with E004, what happens, its salary remains 10,000, which is the default value, and its gender is M, which is the default value, and for the designation it's null because there is no value. And of course we can insert null into this column because there is no not null constraint here. So this is the query for inserting default values in the columns, or using the default values for the columns. And of course when there is no default and when there is no not null constraint, so null will be used. So what happens actually, for the designation column null will be assigned. And then we have some we can actually observe some constraint violations. So one of the violation is a primary key violation. So if we want to insert the data with the primary key violation, and one of the primary key violation is the repetition, which is not allowed. Duplication of the data is not allowed. So for example, if we already have used E004 EMP ID for the previous rows, so we cannot insert any row with the E004 value for the EMP ID, because this is the duplication value. So for this insert query, the database system will deny inserting the data, and it will say and report that the primary key is actually violated here. So E004 data cannot be inserted. And then we can see the violation for the gender domain, because we know that the domain of the gender is that it can only assume F or M values. No other character can actually be inserted. So in this query we want to insert the data, and now you see we have E005, so there is no primary key violation. But here the violation is for the gender column, and we are providing G for the girl, but actually the database the domain of this gender column is that it can only have F or M, so G is not allowed. So it will report the violation of the domain uh, domain of the gender. And then we have the violation for the maximum salary constraint on the salary column. So actually we want to insert the data for the salary, and then for the salary we are providing 95,001. So if we note there is a constraint, we can go into the table definition, and then we have the constraint for this salary column, and this constraint says that the salary cannot be more than or greater than 95,000. So if we provide values up to 95,000, it's okay, but if we exceed from the 95,000, then this constraint will be violated and the rows cannot be inserted. So no employee can have actually the salary more than 95,000 here. So what happens here, we cannot actually add any employee with salary more than 95,000. So the database system will report that there is a constraint violation for the max salary. So this is for the constraint violation. And then finally we have one violation that can happen, and that violation is for the required data. And for the required data we provide the not null constraint, and what not null constraint says is that we must have some value for the column. So for example, the last name is declared not null, so we cannot insert any rows without the value for the last name. So you see that we have the columns employee ID, first name, gender and salary, but we don't have any column for the last name, and neither we have any data for the last name. So there is also a violation of this not null constraint on the last name, and it will say that the data cannot be inserted. So we have summarized all the insert commands here and the scenarios here. So in this video we have explained, and in the next video we will try to run these commands on the LiveSQL. So for now this is all. Thank you for watching, and please keep watching.